I worked for many years for the St Vincent de Paul Society in Australia, and for the benefit of our international visitors, who I'm sure have been familiarised with the fact that in Australia it's a term of affection to shorten or to add an O or a Y to the end of a name of someone or something that people feel affection for, hence salvos, and in St Vincent de Paul Society's case, Vinnies. So I'm going to tell you a story from the time when I was with Vinnies, because I think there might be a little bit of relevance for our meeting today. So first of all, I have to begin by saying I am directionally challenged. I get lost looking for my car in car parks. If I'm driving with my wife and my instinct is to turn left, I know that the correct way to turn is right, and if I take the left turn, she will always say, "Why did you turn left?" When, and you know, it's just, I think it's genetic. I passed it on to my daughter, but she is not as bad as me, thankfully. Anyway, for many years, of course, in my role at Vinnies, I had to spend nearly every sitting day up at Parliament House in Canberra, advocating for the people who've been pushed out and left out of prosperous Australia's economy. And my problem with directions, I saw it in a glass half full sort of way. I saw it as something that was a positive, because it meant that I got to experience the incredible generosity of so many people in Parliament House who told me where to go in the nicest possible way. And despite people's stereotypes about the political class, people were extraordinarily gracious. From the staffers, the advisors, the bureaucrats, the members of Parliament themselves, the catering staff, the security staff, you name it, people would see me wandering around like a little lost sheep, and they would grab me by the shoulders and steer me in the right direction, often holding my hand along the way, because they knew that if they gave me directions, I would just get lost again. So on one occasion, I was standing there looking suitably confused, looking at my phone, which had the name of the room that I was meant to be meeting in and that I was running late for. And a security guard was standing next to me. We were just near the lifts. And he turned to me and he said, you know, typical, he said to me, "What are you looking for, mate?" And I said, "Oh, this room here." And he said, "For a start, mate, you're on the wrong floor." And I said, "That'd be right, mate. I'm directionally challenged," and told him the story of my life, as you do. And then he said, "Look, I'll take you there." Typical generosity and kindness. So we jump in the lift and we chat away, and he looks at my security pass and he says, "So where are you from?" And he looks down and he goes, "St Vincent de Paul." He goes, "Are you from Vinnies, mate?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Come here, let me give you a hug." I said, "Thank you, but, you know," he goes, "I want to say thank you to you." And I said, "Mate, I haven't done anything for you. You're the one that's showing me the way here, you know. I should be thanking you." And he said, "No, your people." And I said, "Yeah, my people are magnificent." And he said, "They helped me out when there was no one else to help me." And I said, "Oh, that's really beautiful to hear." He said, "Do you want to hear the story?" I said, "Mate, I eat stories for breakfast. I'd love to hear the story, thank you." So he said, "I was going through a pretty bad patch. I was long-term unemployed, had some serious mental health issues, and I was living in Nowra. And Centrelink sent me for a job interview to Wollongong. And so I caught the train, went to the job interview, and sweet as, walked out and realised I didn't have two bob to rub together. Didn't have money to buy a pie and a cup of tea, didn't have money for a train trip home to Nowra. And he said to me, he said, you can imagine how I felt like, mate. He said, I thought to myself, who can I turn to in my hour of need? Where can I go? Who will help me when I'm so down and out? Where can I plead my cause? Where can I get assistance from? And then he looked at me and he said, you said you're from Vinnie's, didn't you? And I said, yeah. He goes, oh, actually it was the Salvos. He said, you don't mind, do you? And I said, yeah, I do actually. I said, I don't want to hear good news stories about the competition, mate. He said, that's a joke, right? I said, yes, that's a joke. And so with that, he ushered me to my meeting room and everything was good. 2 weeks later, I was having lunch actually with Kelvin Alley, who was the then National Secretary of the Salvos in Australia. And I knew Kelvin very well and I was very fond of Kelvin. I still am, although I haven't had contact with him for many years since those times in Canberra. And there was a little bit of friendly rivalry, you know. I was a bit jealous. He had the nice uniform and, you know, Vinnie's, all we got at the very best was a baseball cap and an apron, you know. I mean, it was just talk about inequality, you know. And so I said to Kelvin, Kelvin, I've got a story for you that you're not going to be able to beat. And so I shared the story with him. And Kelvin, in his inimitably humble and understated way, said, John, actually, I can beat that story. I said, I doubt that very much, Major, you know. And he said, well, I can. He said, because a week after you ran into that guy in Parliament House and he told you that story, I ran into him. And he said, and he told me the identical story that he told you. He said, with one difference. At the end of the story, he pulled out an envelope which had $20 in it. And he said, could you please give this to the Salvation Army in Wollongong so that they can help someone else the way they helped me? This story cuts me up. It cuts me up for a number of reasons. Because this man, this security guard, like so many of the excluded and the exploited across the world, is consistently told either that he is to blame for his own exclusion, or that if he is patient and if he is well behaved, some of the wealth that is generated at the top for that very small group who are the chief owners of capital across the planet, some of that wealth that is often brutally accumulated will gently trickle down if you're patient enough. Well, I've been waiting a long time and I've been listening very hard, but I've yet to hear the sound of the wealth trickling down. And without wishing to be indelicate, we know, don't we, that it's not wealth that trickles down. And we know that what does trickle down for many people who bear the brunt of inequality doesn't trickle down, it buckets down. But the thing about this story, and we all know how discredited, thoroughly discredited trickle-down theory is, how it's actually designed to protect the purveyors of inequality and to dupe those who bear the brunt of global inequality. The other element in this story that is so beautiful and in a way captures the second part of the topic of today's address. The other element of the security guard story that's deeply local and profoundly global is the fact that while he was told to wait for the wealth to trickle down, the moment he did have a very modest income, and make no mistake, he would have been on a very modest income, if not casually employed, what he gave was a significant chunk of dough. But once he had even a modest means, he did not wait. to give. And so, he really demonstrates that everyone indeed does have a work to do. But the other thing is, what he gave was not charity. It was solidarity. He gave that money to Kelvin because he stood firm with those who were going through what he went through. Not only the financial insecurity, but the systematic degradation, the devaluation, the dehumanisation. The Nicaraguan poet Gioconda Belli said something very beautiful about solidarity, inspired by her own participation in the struggle for social justice and social change. She wrote, "Solidarity is the tenderness of the people." I want to dedicate these few words this morning to the oppressed of the world, to the excluded and the exploited, the discarded and the demonised, the shattered and the shunned, the people across the globe who are very locally, very concretely, and very tenderly called in the Bible Anawim, the poor of Yahweh. Our security guard teaches us what it's like to wage a daily battle for survival from below the poverty line, which is what unemployed workers in prosperous Australia and, let's face it, in most countries across the globe continue to experience. He also teaches us that everyone has a work to do, and contrary to those in power, and I don't just mean political power, I mean corporate power, economic power, because politics really is economics in concentrated form when you think about it. Contrary to those who procrastinate and pontificate, placing their hands on their hearts as they tell us they care about poverty and inequality, but can't afford to fix these complex issues just yet, those who keep wages low, those who keep social security payments even lower, who make an art form out of cruelty to people who are poor, contrary to their practice, our security guard teaches us in no uncertain terms that the only way to do the work is to do the work rather than just talking about doing the work or talking about how hard, how impossible it is to do the work. You know, it's actually liberating to take responsibility individually and, more importantly, collectively. It is liberating to take responsibility instead of feeling enslaved by an unalterable fate. An interesting example of this, in Australia, we've had an absolutely shameful episode known as the Northern Territory Intervention, where the Australian government of the time and subsequent governments from both sides of politics decided to impose a paternalistic regime on the First Nations peoples, predicated on the idea that people knew what was best for them. It was a continuation of the sort of colonising practices. And one of the things that was done, not initially, but actually by it was initially done by a Conservative government, but a subsequent Labor government introduced a program whereby women would be penalised if they didn't ensure that their children attended school. It was a very gendered approach, of course, as well as very racist and disempowering. It produced no results as far as addressing child truancy. But what had historically produced incredibly good results was the period in the 70s and early 80s when First Nations peoples decided to take control and to fight for the right for language, for their traditional languages to be taught in schools. When they took responsibility collectively and took ownership and fought hard for their rights as a people, there was no problem with school attendance, because school was something that was not alienating but something that was liberating. So that's just an example of how, when we take responsibility, or when we allow people to collectively be responsible rather than imposing solutions from above, good things happen. I disparage neither the serious work of evaluation and analysis nor the arduous work of grappling with the complex webs of social, political and economic relations. But what has become the norm, sadly, in many liberal democracies such as Australia around the world is the perpetual postponement of concrete action to arrest the growth of inequality, action that is put off in the name of complexity. It's too complex to do something about. We don't want to just throw money at it, governments will constantly say. If there's one central message I'd like to share with you this morning, it's this: listen to the voices of those who have the greatest expertise in inequality and poverty, namely those who experience it, those for whom it has become the air they breathe. I can think of no sustained progressive social change in this nation's history, or indeed in global social history, that was not won by ordinary people who were subjected to the injustice they were fighting, won by them, often literally on the streets, but not necessarily, under the guiding stars of struggle and hope. Good change might have been legislated from above, but it was analysed and fought for from below. Whether we're talking about workers' rights, women's rights, First Nations rights, climate justice, refugee rights, whatever the cause that makes our society more human, it has come from the people, come from below. Indian writer Arundhati Roy put this very beautifully. She said, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. There's only the deliberately silenced and the preferably unheard." Let us not be amongst, this is no longer Arundhati, by the way, sorry, I should have put commas. Let us not be amongst those who deliberately silence those voices. Let us not be amongst those who prefer not to hear. As Jesus of Nazareth said, anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. We should understand that people do not choose poverty. We should understand that poverty doesn't just happen to people as if they were walking along and fell into a hole. We should understand that, yes, things do happen to people that might be a trigger, such as illness, injury, or the loss of a job, but that we should be the kind of society that looks after people when they're down instead of kicking them. We should understand that the deliberate withdrawal of social infrastructure, the deliberate suppression of wages, the deliberate casualisation and precarisation of work, the deliberate gouging of prices for essential goods and services, that all of these choices coalesce into what can only be described as an act of violence against ordinary people. The founder of Vinnie's, a a French, who was at the time a student, a university student in Paris, named Frédéric Ozanam. He put this very beautifully. He said, "Charity is the oil the Samaritan pours on the wounds of the traveller who has been attacked. But it is the role of justice to prevent the attack." Clear use of the language of violence, because poverty isn't just an experience, it is an act of violence that is socially done to people. And we should understand that the people on whom that violence is perpetrated are ordinary people. And as such, they very simply, no complexity here, very simply want what each of us wants for ourselves and for those we love. A place to live, a place to learn, a place to heal, and a place to work with good wages, good conditions, safety, and for those who cannot work, income support, which means they do not live below the poverty line. That's not complex. In short, what any of us want in life is to be human and to feel human together. What, in very typical Australian idiom, we might call a fair crack at happiness. And to achieve that, we know that governments must do what markets cannot, namely build an architecture of caring so that we can truly care for each other, for ourselves, and for our planet. If COVID didn't teach us this, the importance of social infrastructure, so that we can care for each other and ourselves, if COVID didn't teach us this, we just weren't paying attention. The work we do is richly diverse, but if we're to engage in what the great Brazilian educational theorist and pioneer of adult literacy campaigns, Paulo Freire, called the prophetic annunciation of the good news, we must also honestly and rigorously engage in what he called the prophetic denunciation of the bad news. A few years ago, just around the corner from here, across the road from Town Hall, I was on my way to speak at another conference at Town Hall, and it was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was a young woman sitting on the corner, and I could just hear her from the distance yelling, screaming abuse at people. And the louder she got and the more abusive she got, the more people gave her a wide berth. And I went over and had a bit of a chat with her. And she said to me, I've been sitting here since 5 o'clock this morning and everyone is ignoring me. And she said, I'm not even asking for housing. I'm just asking for enough money to buy a muffin and a cup of coffee for breakfast, and no one will come near me. And then she said something that has stayed with me for years because it crystallises the contradiction at the heart of our society. She said, almost by way of apology, she said, I didn't choose this life, And it broke my heart, because our economy is predicated on the idea of an abundance, a super array of choices, consumer choices. And here she is having to defend the fact that she is homeless because the natural imputation is that she must have chosen that because that's the only way things happen. In a world where she was denied the choice to access the most essential of goods and services, a place to call home. We're the ones as a society who choose to accept the financialisation of housing We're the ones as a society that choose to accept the fact that a person like this young woman, it's okay for her to be utterly disempowered, to have no choices, because sadly, for us, money means choice, and choice means power. I remember a politician in Australia on a current affairs program some years ago actually saying the words, and it struck me, because I just thought, at least he's being honest about how he feels. He said, "Inequality is the measure of our nation's freedom." Well, there's our nation's freedom, the freedom to go without housing, the freedom to go without food. And as you know, and I know I'm preaching to the converted, inequality is never the measure of a nation's freedom. Inequality is the measure of a nation's shame. Inequality gives us nothing to be proud of. What we can, however, be proud of, because you're looking a bit glum here, that's not. It's good to be glum about the bad things, but we can't stay with that. What we can be proud of is this: our collective power to fight inequality by taking the measure of just how much we actually have in common, all of us, including those who are pushed to the edges. And one thing that we have in common that we just don't talk about enough is that we all need help from each other. It's really simple, isn't it? The theorist Judith Butler identifies this. They put it very beautifully. They call this the experience of precariousness. And that's not a negative. Butler says it simply means that our lives are always, in some ways, in the hands of another. A beautiful, beautiful concept. And when you think about it, from the moment we're born, our lives are literally in the hands of another. And throughout our lives, there are times when we need people perhaps more acutely than other times, but our lives are always in the hands of others. Again, COVID taught us that. Rather than being stigmatised, this is essential to our humanity. We're social beings and we should never be ashamed of needing help from each other. Rather than being an alienating experience, the help we give and receive as human beings should be seen as something that binds us together. And at best, it can produce an incredible energy of solidarity and hope, which is why we need to think and act collectively. But the way our economy is currently structured teaches us that to need help is a sign of weakness, a flaw. It means that you can't stand up on your own 2 feet, that you need government, that you need charity, that you need help because you are less than, not because you are human. But what's missing in that false picture is the other concept that Judith Butler identifies, and that is precarity, which is different to precariousness. Precarity, Butler says, is actually a politically induced condition, a decision made by societies through their governments, which mean that some sections of the population are differentially exposed to injury and death and degradation. And we know that in spades. We know how precarity works, and we know that it can be changed. Precariousness, we can't change, we celebrate. Precarity, we can live without, we can do without, and we can stamp it out. So what does precarity look like? It looks like the deprivation of the right to housing, along with the default deployment of the carceral system, which, as Angela Davis points out, disappears people, disappears human beings, doesn't disappear problems. As the Uluru Statement from the Heart so poignantly reminds us, the First Nations peoples of Australia, the oldest continuing culture on the planet, are also proportionately the most incarcerated people on the planet. And as the beautiful Irish proverb tells us, it's in the shelter of each other that the people live. So if any of us are without shelter, it's because the rest of us, due to the political choices we make as a society, have failed them. And when you see someone asking for money on the street, there's a temptation to walk past and say, geez, the system isn't working. But I have to say, when I see someone like that, I have to say to myself, this is proof that the system is working, because it is designed at its heart to produce that kind of concrete inequality locally and globally. Homelessness isn't caused by poverty. It's caused by wealth, concentrated in the hands of the few and therefore denied to the hands of the many. And the opposite of poverty isn't wealth, it's justice. And the opposite of homelessness isn't just housing, it's solidarity, it's connectedness. When you think about, what work it is that we have to do, it's the work of building alliances. It's the work of making sure that the voices of the oppressed are amplified and heard. It's the hard work of prophetically denouncing injustice. And, we've got some pretty fine biblical precedents on that score. The prophet Isaiah, woe betide, many a time I felt tempted to say this in Parliament House, I still do, although the very security guard who helped me might be grabbing me and carting me out if I do. Woe betide those who enact unjust laws and draft oppressive legislation, writes Isaiah, depriving the poor of justice, robbing the weakest of my people of their rights, plundering the widow and despoiling the fatherless. The work we've got to do, I like to characterise as the hard work of hope, so that we do not resign ourselves to these injustices. And hope is a glib word to use, but is hard work if we are serious about making it a concrete reality in our own lives and in the lives of those we stand in solidarity with. And despite all of the bad news, we do not have the right to engage, we do not have the right to indulge in the luxury of despair. Not when there were so many people across the globe who have nothing in their pockets but the tiniest nugget of hope. As Paul of Tarsus said, hope against all hope. You think about the refugees who jump on a leaky boat with nothing but that tiny nugget of hope in their pockets. And so we never have the right to indulge in that luxury of despair. We must help each other resist that ossifying belief that we live in a world denuded of the possibilities of solidarity. Of course, we'll be called all sorts of names for this, particularly by those who wish to protect privilege and who are terrified of equality and justice and compassion. Many years ago, when I just started working for Vinnie's, I found myself outed in that highly esteemed academic journal, the Daily Telegraph, in Sydney, as evidence of the communist control of the St Vincent de Paul Society National Council. So it was a column by a particular right-wing columnist who began with the words, "Comrade Falzon has been reading more Das Kapital than the Bible," and then went on to mangle a paper I had just given at a conference on unemployment, in which I very modestly called for a national plan to address poverty. But he kind of turned it into a call for a national industrial plan, a Soviet-style command economy, and on this occasion I wasn't calling for that at all. He wrote these words. The head of our Social Justice Committee called me up, it was a Saturday morning, and said, "Have you read the Daily Telegraph, Falzon?" And I said, "No, I don't read that rubbish, Terry." And he said, "Well, go out and buy yourself a copy and then consider your future." And I thought, wow, this is going to be juicy. So I read the article and then I did consider my future, and I called the national president and said, "John, this is what has been written about me, and I don't wish to bring disrepute to our organisation, and so you'll have my resignation on your desk on Monday." Now, I just have to say, I'm Maltese background. I have absolutely no right to make fun of any other people except my own, but the national president was Scottish, and so I remember the exchange in Scottish. Very bad Maltese Scottish, so you'll have to forgive me, and if there's anyone of Scottish background, please do not think I'm trying to be disrespectful. It's just the way my memory works, So he goes, "Have you done anything wrong?" I'm sorry, that sounds Italian and slightly. Might be better if I do it while drinking a glass of water. He goes, "Have you done anything wrong?" I said, "Well, that's for you and others to decide, John. I don't resile from anything I've written, but as I said, you will have my resignation." He goes, "Forget the letter of resignation. Draft me a letter." I'm sorry, this is sounding like Lithuanian now. He said, "Draft me a letter to the editor." And so I did. I drafted a letter to the editor, which went over his name, and it was published. And in it, I quoted those beautiful words of Helder Câmara, a Brazilian archbishop who came from a very wealthy background, but who was taught, who was conscientised, who learnt from, who listened to the poor, and so was able to understand the gospel of liberation. And Helder Câmara, who was persecuted for doing so, for standing in solidarity with the poor, Helder Câmara famously said, and this is what I put in the letter, when I give bread to the poor, I am called a saint. But when I ask why they have no bread, I am called a communist. And so, we can expect that kind of critique, but it doesn't matter. Our job is very simple. We help people over the walls that have been erected to lock people out and in many cases lock people in. But while we're helping people over the walls, we chip away at the walls. And we must move away from this concept that the walls that people have to get over are the walls that they have created in their own hearts. The walls, yes, it's true, there are walls in people's hearts. There are walls in each of our hearts. But the real walls that are the problem are the walls that have been socially erected. Luis Mel Madrona, a Lakota man, wrote, "In the Lakota idea, we need to celebrate and support people who are ill because they're the canaries in the mine." A beautiful insight. And that's what we should be thinking. When there are walls, the walls of addiction or whatever inside people, they're indicators of the social ills rather than focusing on that the individual needs to fix themselves up. It's we who need to fix ourselves up as a society, and we need to bring those walls tumbling down. So I'd just like to leave you with two thoughts. Firstly, that we might think that the work we do is minuscule when confronted with the enormity of injustice and oppression. But let me say this to you. I know for my part, and I'm sure for you, if when we die, we can say that we carried even a single grain of sand to the building site of love, to the building site of a new society based on compassion and justice, then that's a life beautifully lived. And how do we do that? Well, we do that by following the sage, wise words of a Ganglu First Nations woman, activist, artist and academic, Auntie Lilla Watson, who so beautifully told us, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. Thank you.